They wrote in their newspapers that Africa had no history, no civilization, no kings worth naming, no armies worth fearing. They lied, because behind closed doors, in the offices of the British War Ministry, in the private letters of generals, in the panicked dispatches wired back to London, there was a very different story being told. A story of thrones they could not topple, warriors they could not break, queens who raised armies, kings who made empires bleed. This is that story. Welcome back to Echoes of the Ancients, the channel where we don't just read history, we resurrect it. Today we are going deep. 5 kingdoms, 5 stories of fire, defiance, genius, and glory that the colonial machine tried to erase. Britain told the world it was bringing civilization to Africa. But you don't send warships and 20,000 soldiers to civilize someone. You send them because you are afraid. Let's begin. Number 5, the Kingdom of Benin. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Forget the word primitive. Forget undeveloped. Forget uncivilized, because the Kingdom of Benin, located in what is today southern Nigeria, was one of the most architecturally and artistically sophisticated states in the entire world. Their capital, Benin City, was enclosed by walls so vast, so perfectly constructed, that the archaeologist Patrick Darling, after years of surveying them, estimated they were 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China, built across centuries by African hands. Before the modern era, European visitors in the 1600s described streets wider than Amsterdam's, a palace of interlocking courtyards decorated floor to ceiling with bronze relief plaques, thousands of them, each one a living archive of Benin's history, military campaigns, royal ceremonies, and divine kingship. When those bronzes first reached Europe, scholars refused to believe Africans had made them. They invented Portuguese influence. They invented outside instruction. They could not accept that excellence had an African address. By the late 1800s, Britain's hunger for West Africa was insatiable. The scramble for Africa was in full effect. Kingdom after kingdom was falling. But not Benin. The Oba, the divine king, controlled every trade route through his territory. Palm oil, rubber ivory, a fortune. And he answered to no one. The British found that intolerable. In January 1897, a British delegation marched toward Benin City uninvited. During a sacred royal ceremony, the Oba had explicitly asked them to postpone. They pressed on anyway. The Oba's forces intercepted them. 7 British officials were killed, 200 African carriers dead. London erupted. Within weeks, Rear Admiral Harry Rawson assembled 1,200 Royal Marines and received a chilling instruction: capture the Oba, burn the city. On February 18, 1897, they obeyed. Benin City burned. The palace was ransacked. The Oba, Ovon Ramwin, was captured, put on trial, and exiled to Calabar, where he died in 1914 without ever returning home. British soldiers looted the palace of between 3,000 and 5,000 objects, the sacred bronzes, ivory carvings, coral regalia, and shipped them back to Britain. The Admiralty then auctioned them off to pay for the cost of the invasion. Let that sit with you. They stole a people's entire recorded history and sold it to cover their travel expenses. Today, those bronzes sit in 165 museums around the world. The British Museum alone holds roughly 900 of them. Nigeria has been demanding their return for decades. As of 2025, only a fraction have come home. But here is what they could not steal. The Oba's bloodline never broke. The Kingdom of Benin never truly ended. To this day, the Oba of Benin reigns in Benin City, a direct descendant of the king the British tried to erase. You can burn a city. You cannot burn a civilization. Number 4. The Kingdom of Dahomey. Now, I want you to picture something. It is the dead of night, deep in the forests of West Africa, in what is now the Republic of Benin. The enemy camp is silent, men sleeping, weapons resting, and then, without warning, absolute, controlled, surgical violence. No screams before impact, no warning, just attack. By the time anyone understands what is happening, it is already over. That was the signature of the Agoji, the Dahomey Amazons, the only all-female standing army in recorded human history. And they were not a symbol. They were not ceremonial. They were the most feared frontline fighting force in West Africa. The Kingdom of Dahomey was built on military dominance. At its height in the 1840s, under King Gezo, the Agoji numbered as many as 6,000 women warriors, roughly a third of Dahomey's entire military. They trained from as young as 8 years old. Muskets, razor-edged blades, hand-to-hand combat, survival training so brutal it would break most soldiers in the world today. They wore distinctive tunics. They shaved their heads. They took a vow that set them apart from the world. No marriage, no distraction, only the mission. And when European soldiers first encountered them in battle, they were stunned. French officers who faced the Agoji wrote home describing their prodigious bravery. Warriors who pressed forward through rifle fire without flinching, who continued to advance even as those beside them fell, who treated death not as something to flee, but as a door to walk through without breaking stride. One French soldier reportedly said he found it impossible to give the order to fire on them, not because he doubted their threat, but because what they were doing seemed almost supernatural. At the center of Dahomey's final resistance stood King Behanzin, defiant, strategic, and unwilling to submit quietly. As French forces advanced deeper into the kingdom, Behanzin adopted scorched earth tactics. Cities were burned before capture, resources denied to invading forces, and resistance continued even as defeat became increasingly likely. Rather than hand his kingdom intact to colonial rule, he chose destruction over surrender. It was one of the final acts of independent Dahomey. Now, Britain wasn't the colonial power that ultimately destroyed Dahomey. That was France. But Britain had watched Dahomey for decades with deep unease. The Royal Navy had attempted to pressure Dahomey into ending its slave trade for years, and found the Dahomey kings utterly unmoved by British threats. When Britain abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833 and began pressuring West African kingdoms, Dahomey looked at British warships on the coast and simply continued, because the Agoji were watching the shore. The end came through 2 brutal wars with France. The first Franco-Dahomeyan War in 1890. The second in 1892. The French brought Lebel rifles, some of the most advanced infantry weapons on Earth. And still the Agoji charged. Historian Stanley Alpern wrote that even in their final battles against the French, the Agoji threw themselves at fortified positions that should have been militarily suicidal and nearly broke through. Nearly. Historians believe only around 50 Agoji survived their final campaigns. All of them had died by the 1970s. The last living Amazon of Dahomey passed from this world quietly, the final ember of a fire that had burned for 300 years. But their memory marvels Dora Milaje, Wakanda's royal guard. The woman king on your cinema screen. 3 centuries of African female warrior excellence. Living on.
Number 3. The Asante Empire.
Let me give you a number. 5. 5 Anglo-Asante wars over a period of nearly 100 years, from 1823 to 1900. The most powerful empire on earth tried to conquer this one West African kingdom and failed again and again and again. The Asante Confederacy, in what is now Ghana, was no ordinary state. Their capital, Kumasi, was a city of order and splendor that shocked European visitors. British officer Thomas Bowditch, arriving in 1817, described a city with wide, clean streets, elaborate architecture, a system of law and governance, and a royal court of such ceremony and sophistication that he struggled to find adequate words for it. The source of the Asante's power was gold, mountains of it. But more than gold, it was unity. The Asante Confederacy was a federation of states bound together by one of the most powerful symbols in all of African history, the Golden Stool, the Sika Dwa Kofi. The Golden Stool, legend said it descended from the heavens into the lap of the first Asantehene, Ose Tutu, placed there by the great priest Okomfo Anokye. It was not a throne. The king himself did not sit on it. It was the living soul of the Asante nation, the spirit of every ancestor who had ever bled for their people, compressed into gold. To possess the Golden Stool was to possess the Asante. The British knew it, and they wanted it. After 4 wars, Britain finally exiled King Prempeh I to the Seychelles in 1896, along with his cabinet and advisors. They assumed that with the king gone, the spirit of the Asante would collapse. They had no idea who they had left behind. In the year 1900, British Governor Frederick Mitchell Hodgson arrived in Kumasi. He gathered the Asante chiefs, and he made an announcement so breathtakingly arrogant, so catastrophically tone-deaf, that it triggered the final Anglo-Asante War. He demanded the Asante produce the Golden Stool so he could sit on it. The room went silent, and then a woman stood up. Ya Asantewaa, Queen Mother of Ejisu, grandmother, farmer, keeper of the Golden Stool. She looked around at the chiefs, generals, nobles, warriors, and she saw men frozen by fear, men calculating odds, men hesitating. She was done with hesitation. She seized a rifle. She fired a shot into the air, and she spoke words that have echoed across African history ever since. If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefield. The chiefs chose her as commander-in-chief, the first and only woman in Asante history to hold that role. She laid siege to the British fort at Kumasi, pinned down hundreds of British soldiers and their allies for months. The governor had to be smuggled out through jungle to escape. Britain was forced to send a relief force of 1,400 soldiers, reinforced from colonies across the entire African empire, just to break the siege. One woman against an empire, and the empire blinked first. Ya Asantewaa was eventually captured, exiled to the Seychelles, where she died in 1921, never returning to her soil. But the Golden Stool, the British never got it. To this day, the Golden Stool remains in Kumasi, sacred, untouched, undefeated. Ya Asantewaa won. Number 2, the Zulu Kingdom, January 22, 1879. Zululand, South Africa. A troop of British scouts crested a ridge, chasing a small group of Zulu warriors into a valley below. They stopped. They stared. Sitting in the valley, in total silence, were 20,000 Zulu warriors, waiting, still as stone, eyes forward. The scouts turned and ran. It was already too late. What happened that day changed the history of the British Empire. King Cetshwayo Kampande had built something extraordinary. An army of between 40,000 and 60,000 warriors, organized into age-based regiments, trained from boyhood, disciplined with a precision that would have impressed any general in Europe or Asia. They were fast. They covered 50 miles on foot in a day and a half without losing formation. And they used a battle formation perfected by the legendary Shaka Zulu, the Impondo Zankomo, the horns of the buffalo, a central mass that pinned the enemy head-on while two flanking horns swept around both sides simultaneously, encircling, engulfing, destroying. Britain had its own plan. Lord Chelmsford, commander of the invasion force, had invaded Zululand in January 1879 on a manufactured excuse. An ultimatum sent to Cetshwayo designed to be impossible to satisfy. Disband your entire army within 30 days. The ultimatum was not diplomacy. It was a script for war. Cetshwayo's response deserves to be heard. He said, "I have not attacked the English. I want to live in peace with them. I ask that they do the same." Britain invaded anyway. Chelmsford was so confident of victory, so dismissive of African military capability, that on the morning of January 22nd, he split his forces and rode off to hunt for what he assumed was the main Zulu army. He had left 1,800 men in camp at a rocky hill called Asantewaa, unfortified, unloggered, exposed. He left them to die, though he didn't know it yet. The Zulu army, 20,000 strong, descended on that camp with a precision that shocked every survivor. The chest hit the British line head-on. The two horns swept wide, moving so fast through terrain that British officers described them as almost flowing around the flanks. Before the British soldiers could reposition, the encirclement was complete. For a time, the British firing line held. The Martini Henry rifle was a brutal, accurate weapon. Zulu warriors fell in hundreds and kept coming. The ammunition began to run out. Quartermasters debated paperwork, while soldiers died waiting for resupply. The line broke, and then
within 2 hours, 1,300 British and Allied soldiers were dead.
Historians have called it the most comprehensive defeat of a British army by an indigenous force, armed with traditional weapons, in the entire history of the British Empire. When the news reached London on February 11th, 1879, it was described as one of the greatest shocks to British prestige in the 19th century. Queen Victoria was devastated. Parliament was in uproar. The government that had launched the war, without even fully briefing London, faced catastrophic political fallout. Benjamin Disraeli's administration never recovered. They were ejected from office the following year. But here is what humiliation does to an empire. It doesn't make it reflective, it makes it vicious. Britain sent reinforcements, more men, more guns, Gatling guns now, early machine weapons designed for industrial slaughter. 6 months later, they burned Cetshwayo's capital at Ulundi. They shattered the Zulu kingdom into 13 separate states by deliberate design to ensure the Zulu could never unite against them again. Cetshwayo was captured, brought to London, presented to Queen Victoria, a king treated as a curiosity. He died in 1884, but the Battle of Asantewaa forced Britain to fundamentally change its military approach across all of Africa. New defensive strategies, new formations, new respect. 20,000 warriors with spears and shields made the greatest empire on earth rethink everything. That is power. And now, number 1, the kingdom that didn't just resist European colonialism, the kingdom that defeated it completely, decisively, on the battlefield, in front of the entire watching world, the Ethiopian Empire. By 1895, the scramble for Africa was almost complete. The map of the continent had been carved up at the Berlin Conference of 1884 by Europeans who sat in rooms in Germany and drew lines through lands they had never walked, over peoples they had never met, dividing up a continent like it was a cake at a dinner party. One nation refused to be on the menu: Ethiopia, ancient, proud, one of the oldest Christian nations on earth, a civilization stretching back more than 2,000 years, stood alone, and Italy wanted it. Italy, late to the scramble, hungry for prestige, struck a deal with Ethiopia in 1889, the Treaty of Wycliffe. It seemed straightforward, but there was a problem. The Amharic version of the treaty said Ethiopia could use Italy to conduct foreign affairs if it wished. The Italian version said Ethiopia must, that it was now an Italian protectorate. One letter, one word, changed in translation. An entire nation's sovereignty stolen in the fine print. Empress Tetu-Betel, brilliant, fierce, and constitutionally allergic to submission, saw through it immediately. When an Italian diplomat warned her that rejecting the protectorate claim might damage Italy's dignity, the Empress replied, "We too must retain our dignity. You want other countries to see Ethiopia as your protege. That will never be." Emperor Menelik II renounced the treaty entirely in 1893. Italy's response was invasion. By 1895, Italian forces had advanced deep into Ethiopian territory, occupying much of Tigray. Their commander, General Oreste Baratieri, was being feted as a hero back in Rome. He had no idea what was coming. Menelik had spent years preparing for this moment. He had played every European power, France, Britain, Russia, against each other with diplomatic brilliance, extracting modern weapons from each without surrendering sovereignty to any. He had built an arsenal of 100,000 rifles, artillery pieces, and ammunition stockpiles, all while publicly projecting weakness so the Italians would underestimate him. In September 1895, he issued a call to arms to the entire Ethiopian nation: men, women, farmers, priests, nobles, warriors from every province. They came. 100,000 Ethiopians marched north toward the Italian positions, the largest African army assembled in the colonial era. And at their side, commanding troops, controlling water supplies, making strategic decisions that saved thousands of lives, was Empress Tetu herself. March 1st, 1896, the hills outside the town of Adwa in northern Ethiopia. The Italian commander, goaded by a furious telegram from Rome demanding action, sent his 17,000 men forward through unfamiliar terrain in the dead of night, expecting to establish defensive positions before dawn. Instead, 3 Italian brigades lost contact with each other in the darkness. They blundered into position in disconnected fragments. Without mutual support, without reliable maps, Menelik saw it. He struck. He hit each Italian brigade separately, overwhelming them one by one before they could reunite. The terrain that the Italians had thought would protect them became a killing ground. By the afternoon of March 1st, 1896, it was over. More than 6,000 Italian soldiers killed, between 3,000 and 4,000 taken prisoner. Historians estimate that 70% of the entire Italian force was either dead or captured in a single day. Italy's prime minister resigned. Its military commander was court-martialed. Riots broke out in Rome. The crowd outside the Italian parliament chanted, "Death to Baratieri," in the streets. And across the world, in the African diaspora, in the Caribbean, in the American South where Jim Crow was crushing black lives daily, the news of Adwa spread like fire. An African king, with an African army, had looked a European colonial force in the eye and destroyed it. Kwame Nkrumah, who would later lead Ghana to independence, said that when he heard of Adwa as a young man in London, it felt as if the whole of London had declared war on me personally, because he felt the weight of what it meant for every black person on earth. Italy was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, formally recognizing Ethiopia as a fully sovereign independent state. No other African nation achieved this through direct military confrontation with a European power during the colonial era. Not one. Ethiopia stood alone. And Ethiopia stood.
5 kingdoms, 5 peoples. 5 stories of a continent that refused to be erased. The Benin Empire, whose art outlasted the empire that tried to steal it. The Dahomey kingdom, whose warrior women became eternal. The Asante Empire, whose golden stool was never surrendered. The Zulu kingdom, whose spears shook an empire to its foundation. An Ethiopia who proved to the entire world that Africa could not be conquered by those who believed it was theirs to take. They called Africa the Dark Continent, but you've just seen what was burning in the dark. If this history moved you, share it, subscribe to Echoes of the Ancients, and drop in the comments which kingdom hit you the hardest, because these stories deserve to be heard, every single one.